Okay,
Yep.
are you there?
Yep. I'm here. Sorry.
Yeah.
Just clicking all the appropriate buttons here.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Let's see. Did I share my screen yet? Share your screen. We're gonna do this screen.
Perfect. Yep, we can see your screen. Ooh. Pretty horses.
All right. So this is topic 3. We are not really talking about USCDI V2, but rather we're having the discussion about the discussions that the Structured Documents Work Group had about the implications to C-CDA. So what Structured Documents did, because HL7 wanted to contribute comments to the draft USCDI, and that is done through HL7's Policy Advisory Committee. And so we convened a task force, which is a subgroup of anyone who wanted to participate that regularly attends Structured Documents, to talk about the things of importance. Not necessarily, we did not talk about every single data element, but rather a select few that people had expressed concern about. And so our goal today is to review those discussions and get your feedback on what our takeaways were about the items and the comments that we made. And now we already, as Structured Documents within HL7, had to provide our comments to the HL7 Policy Advisory Committee, and they will submit by the ONC deadline of April 15th. So, but you are, as we've been discussing, very much encouraged to go ahead and add the same comments or additional or different comments with respect to these topics. And so these are the areas that we focused on. The problems, which within problems, data diagnosis and data resolution, the diagnostic imaging change in class and elements, narrative versus report, encounter information, reflecting encounter diagnosis, etc., and a few things about care team. Those are the things that we focused on. And my slides are essentially almost notes. Normally I create slides with very little words, but I wanted to really expose the notes to you guys and the thought processes, and I'm even going to bring up a Word document with some additional detail about diagnosis state. So with respect to data diagnosis and data resolution, we had a couple of general conclusions, that one of which was that we would provide a comment that we need to bring in, if we're going to be bringing in diagnosis state, that we also we need to bring in date of onset. And we also had mentioned recorded date. However, recorded date is what's often captured and is not necessarily something focused on, and so it's not on the level 2 USCDI data elements. And so we crossed that out, but we thought that there should be a note that, well, that's fine, but we should note that this is often a captured date, and we want to move away to more clinically relevant information about dating. We need to provide more precise definitions for each of these datetime elements, and so we actually had some folks. I think Dr. Holly is on the call today, and her and Dr. Stephen Lane provided some precise definitions, which I know ONC likes. If you say provide a precise definition, please at least suggest what that definition should be. And so in that case, we're trying to do that. But even so, there was still some discussions that occurred. So we wanted precise definitions and examples for diagnosis date, resolution date, and onset date. And we also recognize that structured documents work group needs to provide, depending on what comes out in the final USCDI V2, we will need to provide guidance with respect to representing diagnosis and diagnosis date, onset date, and recorded date. Even though recorded date's not in there, we need to differentiate. How we're going to do that? We figure there's a couple different ways that may or may not happen. Certainly C-CDA examples task force is the easiest, but perhaps not as publicly available as something like companion guide updates. So some of the things we talked about with respect to the updating, that we want to consider if current modeling can handle it, maybe with some more precise definition, or do we need to add extensions? And how will recipients know? Do we need to have a new template ID? These sort of things that we'll figure out as we're developing guidance, if we develop guidance. Things that some of the folks that folks brought up on the call is, how would the recipients know that the new guidance is being adhered to? Do we need a new or different or additional template ID? And I think I mentioned this already, that even though we had brought forward recorded date, but in fact we're going to suggest that, but then realize that we actually couldn't, and then we still are recommending to at least make a note about that. And then we brought up the fact that provenance should be able to capture recorded date. Maybe the tracing of it anyway would be where recorded date could be captured, but even so, you're going to have an initial time where the recorded date is captured. And I wanted to bring up, I know I'm going a little bit fast, but we started late, and so maybe what I'll do is and Jean, maybe you can give some recommendations for this. I can stop after each category and we can chat a little bit, or we can wait until the end to chat about these different things.
Yeah, I think if you go through them and then we'll chat about specific ones, that's probably the best. Get through them all.
Okay. And I'm talking too fast for people to understand. You'll have to tell me to slow down too. Let's see. Let me bring this up. Come on.
We are following along.
All right. There we go. Okay, so these are the definitions developed by Dr. Holly Miller and Dr. Stephen Lane. They participated in the committee, and we did have some additional, you'll see some text here, Dr. Miller, probably that you didn't add. This was the final thing we submitted because we still had questions. And so the onset date was put forth. These are what we put forth for the policy advisory committee to submit. Date patient reports symptom. Onset date is the date the patient reports symptoms, that the symptoms began, or the known date of an event leading to an establishment of a diagnosis. And this may be an approximation. One of the things that they wanted to note is that this field should support fuzzy dates. How fuzzy you can get is, in CDA, it will be a year, right? Really, that's the fuzziest. A diagnosis date will be the day when a physician or other healthcare professional first established the diagnosis, maybe a diagnosis by a pathologist or radiologist or some other specialist, or a provider who ordered a test, etc. And then we had asserted that, in addition to that, if this turns out to be a required need to accept that it may be unknown, and if it is required, because we said that it's focused on an efficient physician or other healthcare professional first establish the diagnosis. Really, sometimes you just won't know. If it's required, we need to have perhaps an additional date field called recorded date of diagnosis. So the patient says, well, I don't know. I had diabetes when I was 10. I was diagnosed with diabetes when I was 10. I don't really know who my provider was. I don't know anything about it. I just know I've had diabetes since I was 10. We discussed, should this be a non-clinician reported date of diagnosis or just reported date of diagnosis? But this is what we need to call out that also, in addition to that, you need to call out that the diagnosis date is indelible. So in other words, if it's been, the first time it was diagnosed, whether it's really a reported one or, the physician initial diagnosis, it's something that's going to be sticking around. We also brought up that sometimes in some systems, rather than on a problem list, the date of diagnosis is only associated with an encounter and only associated with billing codes. So that's something else that the group had a concern with. Again, bringing up here recorded date, which is, to be sure that it's differentiated between recorded date. This is a note that both the docs brought up that, this is a diagnosis may evolve over time. I think, we initially used to handle that in, the concern wrapper in C-CDA. We know that is, that's still, this is, everyone agrees on this and how it's managed with respect to, knowing that this thing that was recorded was a diagnosis versus just a problem versus a symptom, whatever, that these are things we will have to consider when we advise. Resolution date, we didn't have too many, we didn't as a task group have any additional comments on this this definition date. The diagnosed problem was completely resolved. Well, sorry, I shouldn't say that at all. We did have questions because we had concerns about that. This is rarely something that is, these sort of concerns, that they are rarely something that is actually followed through on when for a clinician to go back into the EHR and to put a resolution date on. For example, it might be the next time a patient visits, and so it would have to be post-dated. So somebody goes into an office, has a UTI, doesn't go back again for a year. Sometimes you'll see UTIs that are years long in CCDs, and so we know that, at least we hope that's not true. So these are definitely concerns with respect to resolution date. If it was required, there should be an approximation. There needs to be these concerns brought up or noted. And so some examples here we provided. I won't go through each one of these. I didn't share this document with CDA IAT folks, but maybe that might be helpful to encourage, engender, et cetera, some submission of comments against the USCDI draft V2. But here's some examples that we can talk more about and bring up later, and I will now proceed on to the next topic. Oops. Okay.
So, Gay, with something like that, I'm sorry, we're supposed to hold our questions to the end. I'm just wondering, are there recommendations or just like all that analysis that just got shown? Did structured documents, that work group, say what was recommended, or just sort of presenting the definitions and the requirements, and then leave it to somebody else to figure out what the recommendation is for how to adhere to all those requirements? So
we provided some takeaways, which were basically what I, just because we were running a little bit against the clock there with the task force. They had requested, there's conclusions and takeaways within the slides, and then that Word document is kind of supporting evidence, because we felt as a team that it was important for for folks to see the sort of discussions that went on, the variations and the concerns. And so yes, we sort of made high level recommendations, but then that supporting information. Mm-hmm. And that what was submitted to the Policy Advisory Committee was this PowerPoint, not this PowerPoint, but similar PowerPoint, and the Word document. And Tom Kuhn is the representative from Structured Documents and from the Policy Advisory Committee, who will be helping them develop the actual questions that are submitted, because they're doing their own form. They didn't provide particular forms this year or this time. They're just compiling everything from just a couple of work groups that are submitting, and then so Tom will represent us in the discussions, and then help formulate the questions that actually get submitted, or the comments. Okay, diagnostic imaging, narrative versus report. In USCDI V1, only a narrative was required with respect to diagnostic imaging. So what happened was that they created a new class, diagnostic imaging, and then they have reports within that. One was narrative, report, and order. They're almost, I think almost immediately they started getting comments about this because in both the real world and in the standards, you wouldn't send separately a narrative report necessarily without the data, discrete data elements, if your discrete data elements are present. And so a conclusion is that the report and the narrative, one of our recommendations is the report and the narrative should be collapsed into one data element. This new data element needs precise definition on what exactly this is. And the current submitted definition focuses entirely on LOINC and doesn't, and we all know that the discrete imaging data is more than just LOINC. One of the topics we brought up was that the C-CDA diagnostic imaging report is probably not necessarily in the current state that it is adequate to represent this class. It's not highly used, it's likely outdated, and it contains some highly detailed DICOM object catalog requirements and has terminology issues. So our general conclusion, so this would be at least the equivalent of what we would submit, what I assume they're going to take and submit, that in the diagnostic imaging, the result and the report are the same. It's unclear in report what is meant by discrete data. Is it really just LOINC codes and result values? Is it always quantifiable? Is there should define whether there's a conclusion which would equal a text explanation, or is conclusion also going to be quantifiable, such as normal and abnormal, et cetera. Some discrete data from a radiologist perspective would also include these things such as SOP instance observations, don't ask me what that is, and referenced frames observation. These are both discrete measurement related things that could potentially go along with the report, and we're assuming that does not include this, but we wanted to bring that up to make sure that would probably end up being questions asked by people. And we did not talk about the order. So our takeaways: submit recommendation that the report be collapsed into a single data element, provide precise definition, and can I move along? Maybe you read it on the slide. Additional notes that the group talked about. We said the narrative shall always be present. And need clarity around what are the structured data elements. Is it just a procedure performed for this first round in B2? And what's the workflow around this? Some of the things that we brought up, and I think Emma was the one who brought this one up in particular, is that who, from a certification perspective, is the report generator? A radiology information system typically creates a radiology report. And however many EHRs do not create this report. You might, for example, and Emma, speak up and clear if I'm not saying quite right what you said, but many EHRs won't create this report. They might create a C-CD, which might have an observation, potentially could reference out to the radiology report. And so there was some concern about with respect to this USCDI data element with respect to who exactly has to prove they can do this. Encounter information. There was the encounter diagnosis was added. And then, but we had, did I skip something? Sorry. Nope, but I might have. So encounter, the clarity was needed with respect to encounter diagnosis. With the recommendation of encounter information, these items were needed to have clarity about what's an encounter diagnosis, what is reason for visit, chief complaint, principal diagnosis, and primary diagnosis. So even if the encounter diagnosis is just adding the encounter diagnosis, we actually need definitions for all of the above terms. And we did not come up with definitions for these because we feel that CMS is kind of the final stop with respect to definitions with respect to principal, primary, chief complaint, reason for visit, and encounter diagnosis. And even if encounter diagnosis is the only one that is added, we felt that we need to have these definitions going along with, so that people can implement the encounter diagnosis as understood and with the community in general. Otherwise, you're probably going to get some of these other things in place of or encounter diagnosis when they're really meaning something else. Care team. We need to recognize that all caregivers are not formal health professionals and will not have an NPI. It was the USCDI data element was focusing on that the caregiver should have an NPI. And so this needs to be asserted in the data class. Some other topics came up with respect to security and access information concerns. There, right now, within most systems, we understood that only people that are recognized from within that system are able to access information about information in general, but particular care team members aren't able, because of access and security, I won't say over the top, but it's not open enough for non-healthcare professional team members to get information about the patient. We recognize that this would be a big ask or a big change, and significant changes would be needed within, or are needed within, clinical applications, and as well as paradigm shifts in the community and standards guidance. So we recognize that's a big thing, but if we are promoting care team as what a care team really is, with including the community members, why we need to be able to support that in our systems and our standards. All right, so we have a few minutes to go back and discuss things. So I can scroll back to the slides and also bring up the USCDI V2 if that helps within the context of discussion.
Gay, this is great. And as people think up their questions for Gay, I think one of the big challenges in this area, the recommendations are awesome, but we're really listening for what kinds of actions should we be taking away from this topic that you feel are
Got a response?
At a level.
Yeah, they said the parking is only available to staff.
I don't think we can solve the parking problem, but we might be able to solve some things with extra CDA management support behind some of this. So maybe if folks can help tailor their questions to kind of tease out what are the actionable things that we can do as a result of all this insight.
Can I step back a second? And I need a little more context, Gay. I feel like I'm lost a little bit about how the development of the UDS, all those letters, relates to C-CDAs, and what regulatory bodies are in control where?
Okay, so I took out a bunch of slides from my deck at the beginning to sort of reorient the folks to what USCDI is and the relationship to C-CDA. But I'll speak a little bit to that because Matt and Al actually talked about USCDI. And
I've dealt with it.
So the relationship is that USCDI really just states concepts of things, in my opinion. So let me just bring up so I can give you a little context, because I'm sure this is helpful to do that. Just bring it up a second.
We had a program with money tied to USCDI.
Yeah, so
that's what gets people really focused.
Sure. So what we did as a team, and what I think is similar to what an implementer would do, they're going to say, "Oh gosh, look at these things that we have to do now." And so, with respect to let's just take diagnostic imaging. Diagnostic imaging used to look like this. Let's see.
You make it a bit bigger.
Can I make it bigger?
Hey, Gabe, while you're doing that, is it correct to characterize USCDI as being something that's referenced by regulatory, that regulatory uses to articulate the data that might be required for a particular set of regulations? Like, I don't think of USCDI in and of itself as being a regulation. I think of it more as defining what that regulatory can reference. Is that a misunderstanding on my part? Or because I felt like that question we just got sort of was flirting with trying to make those distinctions.
So right, this in itself is not regulation, but it's and probably that's how it fits into the path of regulation. I think that's more of a Matt and Al question, because I might say something wrong.
Yeah, I probably just did, so you're smarter than I am.
But as far as we know it fits into the path. We know it's like the circle of things being implemented. Us know this is coming down the path. They're gonna they'll have a rule that will
has to adhere to USCDI V2, right?
Right.
So can I can jump in real quick. I raised my hand. You can take it off. I keep double muting myself. Yeah, so at this very moment, USCDI version 1 is included in the regulation. Obviously, USCDI version 1 and USCDI version 2 are technically would be like two separate standards, because USCDI version 2, it's not final. And not until it could be included in the standards version advancement process will be part of, or could it be part of the certification program? But even then, it's not required. Until we come out with a new regulation is when, USCDI version 2, version 3, or version 4 could be included. And, the hope is that industry kind of comes along as we make new versions of this. And whenever we decide to come out with a new rule, it's not as heavy of a lift as you're like going from USCDI version 1 to like version 4 or 5. I missed the first part of your question, but does that answer it?
I think that's it. So, so then let's say the next rule comes out and it will say, okay, now everybody, you have to do USCDI version 2. So folks will come here and they'll see, so this is beta version 1, sorry. They'll come to this page and the USCDI V2 is here, it has draft, it wouldn't say draft at that point. And then they'll see, these classes and elements that they have to be able to capture and or send in their systems. Yeah, however, when you click, I click on a particular thing. Let me go somewhere that I'm not going to talk about. And, you can drill down into the detail a little bit. Why is my system a little slow? And, it will go into, it will say, here, I have to capture diastolic blood pressure. And, well, here's what it says. It says, you have to use LINC 2.67, and for V2, it's 2.69. And then you have to use UCOM. Well, that obviously isn't enough for you to do implementation and it's also standards agnostic. And so we as standards group would say, well, we need to be able to provide the method for by which these things are represented if they're not already. Either say, here's how you do it, or we have to make some changes ourselves. And that's where structured documents is coming in with this commenting process, just to sort of ask for clarity where we need clarity. So that's where, we'll put comments in, and then we would take that information and perhaps develop companion guides, or maybe even do a new C-CDA standard and what have you. And this also, the relationship, Matt, you want to speak up a little bit, but this also, you could expect to have to go for a little bit more detail to the interoperability standards advisory page to then say, oh, well, for this data element, what do they recommend? And again, that bit is standards agnostic. And so the different standard FIRE will take the information and make sure that we're able to describe how to represent that. And structured document work group would take that information and hopefully find some, and provide updates that are needed.
Yeah.
So, Nancy, I don't know if that.
Well, I'm still a little concerned, because I guess what I'm hearing is, so USCDI establishes pieces of data that are important to healthcare communication and tries to define what those are in categories. Then it's a separate step to decide how those should be represented in a C-CDA document and or any one of a number of other templates. And there's some work group that you, I think, Gay, are a part of, that is issuing some guidance about how these things should be represented in these various templates, using the USCDI definition of important concepts of healthcare information.
That's you pretty much have that. I mean, I know but the some work group part, C-CDA comes out of HL7, and the work group responsible for that is the structured documents work group. And so
what's the structured documents work group going to do about the fact that I wish I could quote it with the accuracy that my staff could, but what are you going to do about concepts in FIRE that might be in any one of three places? Are you going to say which one of those you really think is the best one to use? Or is everybody going to make that decision for themselves?
Well, so first of all, structured documents is just responsible for C-CDA and not FIRE.
And not FIRE.
Not any FIRE elements at all. So we do recognize that happens. We do recognize that it seems like no matter how much, how specific you think you're being with your definition, there's still questions. And so, that's one of the processes for which we identified the need to develop companion guides. So companion guides take the more sort of necessarily generic definitions in C-CDA and say, if you're trying to do this thing, meet the concepts that are identified in USCDI or the Interoperability Standards Advisory, this is how it should be done. The thing that is still going to happen, because we don't nail down things absolutely precisely, is people are going to do the implementations differently. So they're going to find something where they can null it, and they'll null it. And they'll, reference to just the sections and the narrative in the section. And because there is a certain amount of flexibility that you still have to provide when you're developing a standard or even a companion guide, you're still going to get variations in implementations. And then if you nailed everything down very particularly, you're going to get uprisings in the implementer community that say that's impossible to do.
But your Word document raised significant issues that you would think would need to be answered, right?
Right, and hopefully, when the V2 comes out, they'll, like hopefully CMS, we're just making a comment like anybody else. I mean, it's coming from HL7, though, via HL7, and so hopefully, for example, in the where we said with encounter diagnosis, go ahead and bring forward encounter diagnosis, but CMS needs to provide their definitions for those, so it's precise, and then we can take it from there.
And then, Gay, wouldn't the process be that, like the examples task force? So one possibility is to make changes or recommend changes in the templates that are in Consolidated CDA. But another is if the templates are sufficient, but just more guidance is needed, then the examples task force would embrace those comments that you had about, let's say, diagnosis date versus onset date versus whatever the things were, and they would make examples and spell out when you want to record a diagnosis date, you do it like this, and if you want to record an onset date, you do it like that, and that gives people the ability to choose to do things more consistently, even though the spec has to allow for variation.
Right, and I think that's totally true, but the only concern I have with it just being off of example task force, not that I just as, I mean, that's been such a huge advantage, but it's not everybody goes to that, not all implementers are aware of what that is, and so it's just a matter of who knows it. So the people that are paying attention are going to do it right.
Right, but it's like a trickle-down approach as opposed to something that would be much broader and faster to get everybody doing something different at a more rapid pace.
Right. So
I would say, as an implementer, you desperately want, when there's regulatory that says USCDI version 2 is now required, and I've got to be concerned with making sure that I'm able to recognize a date of diagnosis when it's coming at me on a CDA document. There needs to be guidance on where to look for that. And if there isn't guidance about how to convey it and where to find it, it's going to be all over the map because of the flexibility that has to be provided by the specification. And I think examples are absolutely necessary, but I think examples alone, you run a huge risk that a lot of implementers don't know to go look at the examples to answer that question of what should I expect around date of diagnosis? And, date of diagnosis obviously is just one example, but I like using a real world example instead of talking in the abstract.
Right. And, another thing is there's so much, we have a lot of flexibility around terminology too. Like a lot of our findings are just, shoulds or shells to a should value set. And so because of the necessariness to provide that flexibility, but that really does a number to, downstream reuse of data to be, too much of a perfectionist, as I've been accused of, with respect to wanting to do the terminology correctly. But then, on the other hand, I understand also the need to be able to say, I don't have a coded diagnosis for this patient because it's a brand new diagnosis, or so that's just an example of some of the flexibility that exists that will probably always exist and probably always be a problem.
Gay, one of the struggles, the charter to be responsible for making the C-CDA spec better and improve it and keep it flexible and moving forward is how big it is, how voluminous it is. And I was wondering if the discussion around clarifying this diagnostic imaging report as being something that is not a clinical note type, if there's any possibility that that might indicate that we could free ourselves from one document type and its associated sections to say consolidated CDA, if it's really the clinical note templates IG, could we get some focus out of that that would allow us to make C-CDA lighter weight by not carrying the diagnostic imaging report document?
Yeah, I don't know. Or a new version of it with, an updated diagnostic imaging. Although I know there's some initiative going on in HL7 with diagnostic imaging reports, but I think that's probably primarily fire focused. But what if what ends up coming up in USCDI is the most important thing here is the narrative. And when we talk about the report and discrete data, we just want an ordered the ordered test, and and the ordered test result could may have encoding if it's possible, but might just have a narrative. So that's, I'm just saying that we talked about that, but we didn't actually assert that. But I think that's what we would. Something like that is what we would ask for. And then, well, then we're not talking about a report diagnostic. We're not talking about a report that currently exists in C-CDA for diagnostic imaging with all this detail that possibly is out of date, but rather, here's the code for the left lower lobe X-ray, and here's the narrative report, and, here's a encoded conclusion of normal. Or abnormal or whatever.
Yeah, that's definitely not what that document type is doing right now.
No, but there could be another one that would be, high level diagnostic imaging report, pragmatic diagnostic imaging report.
Pragmatic, I like that.
Are you saying that would be a simplified version of what currently exists, or let's say the actual report itself? As detailed as it is, are you saying a simplified version in the C-CD would be ideal?
I'm saying that it could be explored.
Yeah.
A diagnostic imaging report, I think that is, going to be satisfactory to those who have real concerns and interest in diagnostic imaging reports. Mm-hmm. Something like that would never be satisfactory, but exactly. From a sort of initial communication standard about it, and maybe the thing would be to create a simple report that would meet the bare minimums.
Yeah, I had a kind of specialty along with everything else I was doing at the time was to send off specimens to labs and then to process the preliminary reports as well as the final reports for any of the doctors. It was mainly for OBGYN and then for general radiology samples that were taken. And so it definitely felt like an extension of the place that I was at. It didn't seem like, it seemed like a specialty, something that was specifically for this. It processed it and it spit out, this highly detailed document for the provider to have. So I kind of see what you're saying. The actual details of it is very, very important. And so to try to sync up this into a CCD, I can see the difficulty in that.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say it would be a CCD, but I could see there could be a simple document type that, within C-CDA that might be for the kind of diagnostic imaging report that a regular EHR system could create, and then perhaps there would be a document reference to the real report.
Exactly, and that's what I was, and that's what I really like. I like the idea of that versus trying to take what already exists and try to kind of fuse it in. It just seems like such a separate part, and it's so specialized. I just don't see it happening.
All right, we're at the at 12:30, so I think it's break time. So I think just to go back to what your goals were, Gay. I mean, it was to review. I mean, obviously the discussions, and basically to encourage people to submit similar or additional comments from, from their organization or from themselves
Mhm.
to the USCDI, right? So everyone has the ability. I know I've, through an organization I'm working for, we've submitted some comments. So everyone has the ability to make some comments on that. So.
Yep, exactly right.
All right. So we've got a break.